The conference hall in Manila was filled with tension as Captain James Bradford slammed his fist on the wooden table. His face was red with anger as he stared across at Lieutenant Miguel Santos, the Filipino liaison officer assigned to guide the joint military operation. "With all due respect, Lieutenant, my Marines don't need a history lesson from someone who's never seen real combat," Bradford said loudly, his voice echoing through the room. The other American officers nodded in agreement, their arms crossed as they looked at the map spread across the table. They had been planning this mission for weeks, and now this Filipino officer was trying to tell them how to do their job. The route through the mountains was the fastest way to reach the enemy position, and Bradford was not about to waste time taking a longer path just because of some local superstition or outdated information. Miguel stood up slowly, his jaw tight with frustration as he tried to keep his composure. He had fought in these mountains for 5 years, knew every trail and every village, and lost good friends to the brutal ambushes that happened in that exact valley Bradford wanted to march through. "Captain Bradford, this is not about pride or disrespect," Miguel said firmly, pointing at the map with a steady finger. 3 months ago, a Filipino patrol of 20 men went through this valley. Only 2 came back alive. The enemy knows this route. They have positions on the high ridges, and they wait for anyone foolish enough to walk into their trap. He looked around the room at the American faces, hoping someone would listen to reason. "There is another path. It takes 6 hours longer, but it goes through friendly villages where we can get support and avoid the killing zone." But Bradford just laughed and shook his head, gathering his papers as if the meeting was already over. "We move at dawn through the valley. That's final," he declared, and walked out of the conference hall with his officers following behind him, leaving Miguel standing alone with a terrible feeling of dread in his stomach. The morning sun was just beginning to rise when the Marine company of 80 men started their march into the mountain valley. Captain Bradford led from the front, confident and proud, his boots crunching on the rocky path as birds sang in the trees around them. The Marines were in high spirits, joking and talking among themselves, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. They were well-trained American soldiers, equipped with the best weapons and gear, and they believed nothing could stop them from completing their mission. Behind them, Miguel Santos walked in silence with 3 other Filipino scouts, his eyes constantly scanning the ridges above them. He had been ordered to accompany the Marines despite his warnings being ignored, and now he felt like he was marching toward a funeral. The valley was beautiful, but deadly quiet, too quiet, and Miguel noticed that the usual sounds of the jungle had stopped. No monkeys in the trees, no birds calling, just an eerie silence that made his skin crawl with warning. As they moved deeper into the valley, the path became narrower, and the walls of rock on either side grew taller and steeper. Miguel tried one more time to convince the captain, jogging forward to walk beside Bradford. "Sir, please, we need to turn back," Miguel said urgently, his voice low but intense. "Look at the ridges. Look how perfect they are for an ambush. My scouts have seen signs, broken branches, footprints in the mud. The enemy is watching us right now." But Bradford barely glanced at him, annoyed by the interruption to his confident march. "Lieutenant Santos, if you're scared, you can wait at the rear with the supply carriers," Bradford said dismissively, loud enough for nearby Marines to hear and chuckle. "My men are United States Marines, and we don't run from ghosts in the jungle." Miguel felt anger and fear mixed together in his chest, but he said nothing more and fell back to join his Filipino scouts. They exchanged worried looks, checking their weapons and ammunition, knowing that when the attack came, it would be sudden and brutal. The Marines continued forward, walking straight into the trap that Miguel had desperately tried to help them avoid, and with each step, they moved closer to disaster. The explosion came without warning, a massive blast that ripped through the center of the Marine column and threw men through the air like broken dolls. Miguel hit the ground instantly, his training taking over, as machine gun fire erupted from both ridges above them, bullets tearing through the air with a sound like angry hornets. The Marines who had been laughing and joking seconds ago were now screaming in pain and confusion, trying to find cover where there was none. Captain Bradford was shouting orders, but his voice was drowned out by the constant gunfire and the screams of wounded men. The enemy had positioned themselves perfectly on the high ground, firing down into the valley where the Marines were trapped like fish in a barrel. Bodies fell everywhere, young soldiers who had been alive and strong just moments before, now lying still in the dust and blood. Miguel crawled on his belly toward a large boulder, dragging a wounded Marine with him, bullets kicking up dirt all around them as the enemy fire showed no mercy. The ambush was perfectly executed, exactly as Miguel had feared, and the Marines were being slaughtered. Bradford finally understood his terrible mistake, but understanding came too late as he watched his men die around him. He tried to organize a defense, screaming for his soldiers to return fire and take cover, but the Marines were scattered and panicked, many of them too exposed to move without being cut down immediately. Miguel and his 3 Filipino scouts were the only ones who knew what to do, moving quickly between rocks and fallen trees, pulling wounded Americans to safety and returning fire at the enemy positions with careful, precise shots. "We need to move to the north side. There's a small ravine that gives us cover," Miguel shouted to Bradford, who was crouched behind a dead tree with blood running down his arm from a bullet graze. For the first time, Bradford looked at Miguel with something other than arrogance, his eyes wide with fear and the horrible realization that he had led his men into a massacre. The enemy fire intensified, grenades began exploding among the trapped Marines, and Miguel knew that if they didn't do something fast, every single one of them would die in this valley that he had begged them to avoid.
Miguel made a split-second decision that would either save lives or get him killed. He gathered his 3 Filipino scouts and explained his plan in rapid Tagalog, their faces grim but determined as they nodded in understanding. "Captain Bradford," Miguel shouted over the gunfire, crawling closer to where the American officer was pinned down with about 20 surviving Marines. "My scouts and I will climb the east ridge and attack the enemy from behind. It will draw their fire away from you and give you a chance to move the wounded to that ravine. Once you're in the ravine, follow it north for half a kilometer, and you'll reach a village where my people will help you." Bradford stared at Miguel with disbelief and shame, realizing that this Filipino officer he had mocked and dismissed was now offering to sacrifice himself to save American lives. "That's suicide, Lieutenant. You'll never make it up that ridge," Bradford said. But there was gratitude and apology in his eyes. Miguel checked his rifle and gave Bradford a serious look. "Maybe, but it's the only chance any of us have. When you hear us firing from above, you move fast and you don't stop. Take care of my country's honor, Captain, and maybe next time you'll listen when a Filipino tries to help you." Without waiting for a response, Miguel and his 3 scouts began their dangerous climb up the eastern ridge, using every bit of cover they could find as bullets whizzed past them. The enemy fighters on the ridge were so focused on shooting down at the trapped Marines that they didn't notice the 4 Filipinos climbing up behind them until it was too late. Miguel reached the top first, his lungs burning and his muscles screaming, but he didn't hesitate as he opened fire on the surprised enemy soldiers. His scouts followed immediately, their rifles cracking in rapid succession as they attacked the ambushers from their flank. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The enemy fighters on the East Ridge turned to face this new threat, their fire shifting away from the Marines below. "Now! Move now!" Bradford screamed to his men, and the surviving Marines scrambled toward the ravine, half carrying and half dragging their wounded brothers, while Miguel and his scouts fought desperately above them. The enemy realized too late what was happening, trying to split their forces between Miguel's attack and the escaping Marines, but the confusion gave the Americans the precious minutes they needed. Miguel felt a bullet slam into his shoulder, spinning him around, but he gritted his teeth against the pain and kept firing, covering his scouts as they slowly fought their way along the ridge, drawing more and more enemy attention away from Bradford's retreating Marines.
2 days later, Captain James Bradford sat in a hospital tent in Manila, his arm bandaged and his eyes haunted by what he had witnessed. Of the 80 Marines who had marched into that valley, only 43 had survived, and most of those were wounded. The losses were devastating, a tragedy that could have been completely avoided if Bradford had only listened to the warning he had been given. But the number could have been 0, every single Marine dead in that valley, if not for the courage of Lieutenant Miguel Santos and his Filipino scouts. Miguel had survived the battle, barely, with 2 bullet wounds and a deep cut across his ribs, but he had held that ridge long enough for the Marines to escape. His 3 scouts had all been wounded as well, but they had fought like lions, and their bravery had saved dozens of American lives. Bradford had made it to the village Miguel had mentioned, and the Filipino civilians there had hidden the wounded Marines and treated their injuries until rescue arrived, asking for nothing in return except respect for their sacrifice. Bradford requested an immediate meeting with Miguel as soon as the Filipino officer was well enough to walk. They met in a quiet corner of the hospital compound, and this time there was no arrogance in Bradford's voice, only deep remorse and genuine respect. "Lieutenant Santos, I need to say something to you, and I need you to hear it clearly," Bradford began, his voice thick with emotion. "I was a fool, and my pride cost good men their lives. You tried to warn me. You tried to save us from my own stupidity, and I dismissed you like you were nothing. Then, when everything went wrong, you risked your life to save mine and my Marines. You and your scouts are the reason any of us are still breathing." Miguel listened quietly, his arm in a sling, and exhaustion written on his face. "Captain, I didn't do it for thanks or recognition. I did it because those were human lives, and because I believe that when people work together and listen to each other, everyone becomes stronger. War is hard enough without making enemies of our allies." Bradford nodded slowly, learning a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his military career. The story of Miguel's warning and the brutal ambush that followed spread throughout the American military, becoming a powerful reminder about the importance of respecting local knowledge and listening to experienced allies, no matter where they come from. And in the Filipino military, Miguel became a legend, the officer who saved American lives even after being disrespected, proving that true courage means doing what's right even when others fail to see your worth.